Hey, Scott Hambrick, scotthambrick.com. This is a little quick show about a book I just picked up. I've been seeing a lot about it on the interwebs. It's Bronze Age Mindset, written by a pseudonymous author. He goes by Bronze Age Pervert. You may have seen this guy. He also goes by Bronze Age Mantis. You may have seen this guy on Twitter. He's been part of the kind of manosphere. And this book has gotten really popular. It's been rated or ranked highly in sales and philosophy on Amazon, surprisingly, and has made a little bit of a stink. And it's an interesting book. Bronze Age Pervert, nobody knows who this guy is, or at least nobody I know of knows who this guy is. And he has written a very interesting book that is of a philosophical nature. He is not politically correct in any way. He says things, or he writes things in this book that are probably offensive to many. He uses language in this book that polite people don't use. But I think he does all of this in service of making his point. The book reads a little bit like a philosophy that book that maybe somebody like Charles Bukowski would write. But even though I say that, the very first line of the prologue, he says, "This is not book of philosophy, it is exhortation." His writing style is very interesting. He doesn't use the indefinite article, so it reads like a Russian wrote it. This is not book of philosophy, it is exhortation. He uses a lot of 4chan speak, like what do girls or GRILs, grills. So I don't know. Maybe he's Russian. Maybe this is just affectation. But it's an interesting book. But as I say, as he says, right at the very beginning of the book, it's not a book of philosophy. It is an exhortation. And it isn't philosophy, but it's very philosophical. And he takes great issue with where modern civilization is and where it is leading us. He has what he calls a Bronze Age mindset, and he wants us to also have a Bronze Age mindset. And the Bronze Age is really the age of the Greeks for him. He wants us to not be caught up in the idea that science and technology lead to progress. Like, progress to what? What does that mean? Just because we have technology and just because we have science and maybe know something about chemistry doesn't really mean that man can be more fully man and that there's progress. And he has a love of mankind that drives him to understand the minds of other people and to want a better life for other people. And he sees, in his opinion, that science and technology don't really lead to progress, and he's very skeptical about science, and I think he sees it as consensus taking at this point, that peer review is really consensus taking. The book is written, this review or this overview of the book is going to be very kind of hodgepodge because the book is hodgepodge. It's written in a series of 3, 4, 5-page little vignettes or little essays that he numbers like 1 through, let me go look here, 1 through about 80. And they don't hang together entirely. It's kind of like reading Montaigne. So early on in the book, he tells us to be skeptical of science. He's very skeptical of Darwinism. He's not necessarily skeptical about the evolutionary process, but he's skeptical about Darwinism, and he makes a distinction between the two. You'll have to read to get that more fully fleshed out. But he says that man's best nature and true nature leads him to struggle to own and master space. And he thinks that healthy people do this best. Of course, healthy people do human stuff best. And he believes that aesthetic bodies are windows into this transcendent not really manhood, but manness or humanness. And so if you follow him on Twitter, you'll see that he posts pictures of beautiful landscapes, beautiful scenery, and aesthetically beautiful people, because he thinks there's something transcendent about that points to something ultra-human and ultra-wonderful about people, and that the more aesthetically beautiful the body is. He's kind of Greek like this. If you see Greek statues, you see that they thought the same thing. That the more aesthetically pleasing the body is, the more healthy and the more able that person would be to move and be in the world. Clearly, right? It makes sense to me. And he says, because man wants to own and master space around him, he says that the underworld is where he wants to be, where he likes to be, because it's in the underworld where some people can own that space without the masters. And he talks about our lords, our masters, and that they're unseen. He never names who those people are, but he seems to think that he believes that that's true, and he doesn't believe that history or society has been emergent. He thinks it's planned, and because he believes that there is a plan by our lords. He believes that in the underworld is where you can escape the plan from time to time, where the whores and the pimps and the gamblers and the junkies are. That's where society is the most free, where it's where the fringes are. Because he wants us to have this Bronze Age mindset. He wants us to have the mindset of the barbarian. He wants us to be close to nature, and he loves the piratical mind. Remember, there's all kinds of piracy. It's not just crime on the high seas. It's just being a scofflaw to some extent. And he says that in our own spaces, discovery takes place best because discovery is felt. And it's not rational. He thinks that, anything that we've learned, that mankind has learned, has been because somebody felt something and had a realization. And then later on, they used their rationality to describe it so other people could know what that was. But he thinks that discovery takes place best in your own space. I think Nietzsche said you shouldn't trust any ideas that you have indoors. And Bronze Age Pervert seems to agree with that. He wants you to be in your own space and be unencumbered so that you can have that real discovery. And these real discoveries happen to real people. We're back to that sort of aesthetic beauty, that physicalness. And he says that real people have an excess of being. And he talks about, or he writes about like Achilles in the Iliad being consumed in fire. And it was in that when his helmet and his shoulders are on fire in the last half of the Iliad, he says that's because he had an excess of humanity that was just pouring out of him. It was an excess of being. It's fascinating stuff. and because modern man doesn't really have that excess of being. He says, here's a quote, "The weakness and spinelessness of modern man, because of that, no God would show himself to such creatures." And later on he says that the God would only be jeered at. Seems true. Here's another little quote from him. "The development of civilization and comfort leads to the proliferation of damaged life. The innovation of mankind leads to unspeakable abortions of life, and men on the periphery who want to preserve the natural order begin to plot the end of everything." Yeah, we see some nihilism out there, right? And then he goes on a rail against nerds. I think it's fairly interesting. He says that nerds... I want to just read a whole chunk here. He says, "There are very rare people in history, even a few saints and martyrs, who were ashamed of their evil character and will and sought salvation in contemplation, sought some escape in this. These are sometimes noble people, but this doesn't describe the nerd. The nerd doesn't hate himself, his nature, his tendencies or spirit, nor is his intellect powerful enough to overawe his needling will and consider things without the pressure of interest or the gravity of petty desires. He never sees things like the true genius or the artist does, when the perceiving part of the intellect becomes so powerful that it really overpowers everything else. so that the fullness of the object occupies all of the consciousness of and an idea or some new insight into the world is actually grasped. No, the nerd is the nerd is a creature of will, under the direction of a petty will in the everyday sense, and all of his thoughts, concepts, and designs have a forced quality because they refer always to need and desire for some kind of gain. This very often is just material gain, but the desire for prestige is even worse. In men of intellect, the desire for prestige is often the most disgusting, especially when there's no native manliness, because this leads to cowardice and lies to others and oneself. For this reason, Nietzsche said, manliness is the first requirement of the philosopher, but there's no one farther from the philosopher than the unmanly nerd. And there's no enemy more implacable of the human race and of the genius of the species than just this nerd and everything he represents. The attempt to mimic life through algorithm, through the brute force of trial and error, will never create either life or consciousness. So now he goes on to talk about AI is the ultimate nerd because it has no physical being. See, that the nerd doesn't interact with his environment. The nerd isn't robust physically, and as such, life is all an abstraction. And life being an abstraction, nerd really doesn't understand it and treats life as a toy. He has great contempt for the nerd culture. Because life is an abstraction, because they're not robust physically, they're very, very prone to consumerism, and they turn into what Bronze Age Pervert calls bugmen, the bugman. And they live in cities, and cities destroy people's ability to control space, and it controls in that when they don't have that ability to control the space around them, like rural man or primitive man or Bronze Age man did. They start to despair. They don't have freedom and they don't have agency. He says something really interesting here about homosexuality. Again, a lot of people are going to find him offensive and be mad about it, but I just think that this is really interesting, especially in light of the fact that this book is like a kind of a cult hit and is bringing a lot of people to think about these old books. You know, he quotes from Homer, Aristotle, Plato, Herodotus, Thucydides, Nietzsche, Hegel, a whole lot of the canon. So that's what I heard about him in his doing of this, and that brought me to him. And he talks about homosexuality here. He says post-industrial life moves some people to become gay, he says. He says that there are some people are born gay, but he says a larger number perceives what his peers do not perceive, that the conditional and entirely dependent it's the conditional and entirely dependent character of life in our age. It's not the masculinity and the competition for status among men, the physical roughness that makes him turn away, but the fact that all such play is happening in an already owned space. So we'll stop here for a second. A lot of the masculinity that we see is in an already owned space. It's professional sports. It's in the ring, right? It's in the ring. It's circumscribed. We'll go on here. It is this aspect of our time that is crucial to understand. When I speak of something like owned space, it must not remain mere word. When you understand something, I mean you must feel it like you would a landscape you know from youth. How to navigate all its nooks, the different heights of the earth, the bank of streams, where the trees are and how it feels inside them, how long it takes walking from this or that group of beach to the abandoned factory, so that the map is already in your body. This is the way to really understand something. See, he believes that you discover things and that you have a sense of them, and the knowledge of those things is ingrained in your body. You feel these things. So he goes on to say, I believe boy like this, remember he writes like a Russian, I believe boy like this is one of the types that sees through the charade the Lord of Lies have dangled in front of us, the shadow play to dazzle the many, and he is turned off, maybe not by manliness, but the buffoonish, deluded character of modern masculinity. So he says that a lot of men see the buffoonish masculinity around them, and they reject it. And he says that true manliness, which in a state of ascent develops into the will to actually dominate space around oneself, has been turned into a caricature for the benefit of gaining women. So, I get that. You see a lot of people. You see in men, we often see a lot of swagger, a lot of affect that's put on so that they can date, right? So they can be successful with women, or what they think is going to help them be successful women. You see people that play their sports ball and MMA fighting, and all of these things are, acting at masculinity, but in this already owned space, and they don't have the way to be masculine in their own way, or at least they don't see a way to do that. And he says that a lot of people who are homosexual are rejecting masculinity because they see how disgusting the caricature of masculinity has become. And then he also says that in doing that, they get their own space. Like in the 60s and 70s and part of the 80s, there was a whole sort of underground gay community, and in that community, they had their own space that they could own, and they could act in that underworld with primacy. So that's very interesting and important to him, and I think it's important to everybody to have a place that's their own. And they had that, but now that they've been that they're able to come out and all that, he says now they have to rejoin society. They're expected to marry, get the mortgage, be normal. Now they can't have agency. Now they can't own their space anymore. But he says that humanity is large in the underworld and in the fringes, and now their space is gone. It's an interesting idea. Later on, he tells us more about what this Bronze Age mindset is. It's the mindset of the pirate, of the barbarian, of the man of the open steppes. He's not an urban person. It's the Spanish conquistadors, the men of the open sea, Genghis Khan. These are the people who were the most human. He says how worthless. He talks about Alcibiades, who was a super pirate of the Greek era, who everywhere he went ascended to leadership and was just larger than life. He says how worthless the vaunting of these anxious creatures who live on pharmaceuticals, cheap wine, the rancid fart fumes of status and approval they beg from each other in the face of these characters like Alcibiades or Alexander the Great. He says the energy that remains to them is channeled in the normal man now. The energy that remains to them is channeled into mindless work for money. And he says, like, even wealthy people don't embrace the fact that they have agency. He said 50 years ago, wealthy would often list sportsmen as their main profession. But now they still seek out jobs and things to toil at. But he says truly, truly powerful people own that space, the space around them. They have agency. They find opportunities for agency, and they harness energy. So there's, physical energy is very, very important to him. And intellectual energy is very important to him. But he also says that the truly powerful know how to harness the energy in attention, in getting people's attention, and in sex. And in understanding the mind of other people. In becoming this person with the Bronze Age mindset that he's encouraging us to be, he knows that our modern lords are terrified of people that are carefree and full of lust and passion. And he knows that because he can see that in history. He says that history, though, has taken place of religion, because now it tells people how to act and what's expected of them. It sets examples and provides a context for where they came from that religion used to provide. But because they use history as their religion, they see themselves in a scope of activity that has a beginning, and they think it has an end, but it doesn't. So the social problems have always, because he looks at history and he sees what's happening in society today, he says that the social problem of all time has always been what to do with young males. And today, according to BAP, marriage has become an economic activity, and as such, it's dysgenic. People don't marry for the other person because of fitness; they marry them because of economic reasons. And in fact, people take the economic into consideration. Even though we're wealthier than we've ever been, they take the economic into consideration so much that many don't even reproduce. So society is completely dysgenic and doesn't know what to do with young men. There's nowhere for them, and all the spaces are owned. At the end of the book, he exhorts us to become undomesticated and to help other people become undomesticated by seeking opportunities to act with them and to be strong and to be a modern pirate. He tells us to lift weights and to worship beautiful things and to point out the beautiful to people wherever we can, and to nourish ourselves with good, clean food. He worries about food quality and worries about us being poisoned by residual birth control in the water from all the birth control that people have been eating and excreting now since the 1960s. And he's worried about the cessation of masculinity. It's an interesting book. It's going to make it is making a lot of people angry. I found it to be just fascinating. The guy is fun to read. He's funny. He's irreverent. He's well-read himself. And he has an interesting vision here. And he actually has some prescriptions. He tells us that there's some stuff that we can do and that we should do. And it's interesting. Go check it out. Go check out Bronze Age Mindset. If, many of you know that I love the Western canon of literature. And if you're not quite ready to jump off into that, you could go check out Bronze Age Mindset and see somebody who's really deeply influenced by particularly the Greeks and the Romans, and give you a good jumping off point maybe to get into some of those other books. But if you're interested in seeing a little bit about what's happening on in the underbelly of the web, this is another interesting way to see what some of those neo-reactionary politics that are forming out there look like. Well, hope that was interesting to you guys. Go check out Bronze Age Mindset. It's 198 pages. It reads well. It's fun, and it's just a quirky book. And it's very interesting. Very interesting. Go get it.